This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is beavers and their role as a keystone species in the battle against global warming. This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is beavers, and we're going to be talking about the role of beavers as a keystone species and a species that will help in the battle against global warming. I'm joined by Chris Jones. He is from the UK, and he belongs to an organization that has a lot of knowledge about beavers. So welcome, Chris. If I could you give a little background about yourself and the organization that you represent?
Thanks, Dan. Okay, I am currently, for a few hours longer, the Director of Community and Land for Beaver Trust, which is a charity I helped to set up 3 years ago. And we've been growing since then, and we are basically pushing for all things beaver in Britain. We're a long way down the road to getting this species back, but there are still some significant obstacles. By background, I'm a farmer, and I think that gives me a certain amount of strength when we have to remember that every bit of environmental work we do out there is on land which belongs to someone, and significantly in the UK context, about 70% of land belongs to farmers, one way or the other. And so it's quite useful to actually have an organization with a farmer in it, because it makes communication, I think, with farmers just a little bit easier. I also have beavers on my own property through something called the Cornwall Beaver Project, which I set up with some other people in 2014, and we've had a family of beavers living on the land since 2017. So I've got a little bit of practical experience, but I've also got a good deal of practical farm experience, and I've been considering ecology as the major factor in any land use now going forward for about the last 15 or 20 years.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about what you're trying to do with the organization a bit further on when we get to solutions for global warming. Can we talk a little bit about what a beaver is versus some other of the rodents? I know it's the second largest rodent next to the capybara, and I know from having looked up that there once were significantly larger beavers the size of brown bears. What is the modern beaver that we're talking about now?
Okay, it's a rodent, as you said. It's an animal that weighs, on average, somewhere around about 20 kilos. A big one might be 30 kilos. So in American terms, I guess that's 65, 70 pounds, maybe, a really big one. It is incredibly adapted to live in an aquatic environment. It's quite a slow, bumbling animal on land, and it's quite a convenient package of fat and protein, and much enjoyed by wolves and bears and all sorts of predators. So it uses water as its kind of security blanket. And where you have a big, deep river, they don't need to do anything very special apart from dig a burrow in the bank to live in and to have their young. Where you've got shallow streams, they've got this incredible innate behavior which makes them make the water suit themselves. There are very, very few animals that really change the environment to suit themselves, and they are one of them. Well, we can talk a lot about that as we go along, I guess. They are not just well adapted to live in water. They're incredibly useful to humanity dead. They're an extraordinary resource. They have a wonderful fur, they have plenty of meat on them, and they also have castoreum, which is used a lot, or has been used a lot, in herbal medicine, in perfumes, in flavorings, and so on. So, it's been their misfortune to be incredibly useful to us. dead. Um, and beyond their habits of producing dams, and those dams then lead to wetland and a whole host of other things. They are incredibly useful to a lot of other species, because anything else that depends on water or depends on changing vegetation really gets on very well in their presence. And I can give you some facts and figures later on, if you like, about what we've found directly in our little site here in Cornwall, which has got beavers on.
Well, are they now? They are not predatory. They're not carnivores. They are. Are they omnivores? Are they herbivores? Because they're not related to martens or
They,
minks or
they,
ferrets.
they are completely herbivorous.
Yeah.
They're complete, but they create conditions which are incredibly good for a bunch of other animals which are not herbivorous. They create the conditions which are ideal for things like otters and mink and fishes. They create abundant habitat for lots of prey species like fish and muskrats and voles and what have you. So really, they're a fundamental keystone species. These days, just about everything, people say, "Oh, that's a keystone species." Well, not really. There are very few, in my view, that are fundamental to so many different things, and beavers are one of them.
I know in looking up beaver's teeth, people know that the beavers have the big buck teeth, and they gnaw. Here in Texas, there's a gasoline chain called Bucky the Beaver. But apparently that's very much an outlier. Do we know through evolution how they developed this set of teeth that stand out from even the rest of the teeth in their jaw?
Well, they are similar to other rodent incisors in that they grow continually. Now, as the beaver has grown in size away from a little mouse, let's say, a proto-rodent like a mouse, clearly the teeth have had to grow with it. But also, as they've taken on this habit of felling trees, they've needed an incredibly powerful set of teeth. And indeed, these don't just sit in incredibly powerful jaws, really well-muscled jaws. They're also adapted to working with heavy-duty vegetation by having iron impregnated in the front surface of these teeth. It's ordinary dentine on the obverse, but the anterior surface has got iron in. And what it means is the front is incredibly hard. The rear of the teeth is just hard, so you get differential wear. So as they're working away, chewing on a tree, for example, their teeth are self-sharpening. So they are an incredible example of evolution in action.
Now, there are two surviving beaver species that we know of, the Americas and Eurasia. What is the difference between them? Do they serve the same function, or do they have any particular peculiarities that are different between the two species?
Visually, they are almost identical, and certainly in their habits, they are almost identical. They have similar numbers of young. They breed once a year. They are monogamous. They build dams when they need to. They dig canals when they need to. They pretty much have an identical ecological function. In fact, you could say it is an identical ecological function. But they've been far enough apart geographically to actually develop different genetics and have a different number of chromosomes. So it is virtually impossible for the two species to interbreed.
Which is the species that came first? I would assume it's the Eurasian species, and then some of them migrated across the land bridge, the Beringia, or did they go in the other way from Europe, let's say across the ice to Greenland and then to Canada?
Do you know, I have absolutely no idea what the answer to that question is.
Okay.
I think it is of academic interest. Does it really matter very much? I don't think so. I mean, I'd love to believe that beavers actually originated in England, but I dare say that's not the case. So I shan't be waving any sort of national flag in support of them. No, I think that the critical thing is we have got on our hands a a natural uh, ecosystem engineer, which, while we're all sleeping, is out there doing incredibly important work. Which it's important for us, but it's important for everything else in our landscapes as well.
So I want to get back to the concept of a keystone species, and I'll give you an example here in America. Uh, Back 100 years ago, wolves were hunted to the point of extinction in Yellowstone National Park, and then everything went awry. River systems, the foliage got less dense. Deer exploded in population, and they found 30 or so years ago when they brought the wolves back, they kept the deer in check, which meant the deer ate less, which meant that the river systems foliage came back around the rivers. There was less loss of soil. In a similar way, it seems that beavers do a similar thing by retaining water and helping to recharge water tables underneath, also helping to you know get more foliage around trees, and erosion seems to be one of the major things that they prevent again. So talk about the beavers, if you would, as a keystone species and what they actually do in a beaverless environment versus a beavered environment.
Okay. Well, I'll just talk through this through the microcosm of my own direct experience here. Before the beavers came, we had one small stream, basically in a ditch, running through a piece of wet woodland. We had to have these beavers enclosed behind a fence. That was just the way the law was at that point. And we put the beavers in there, and within 36 hours, they'd begun building a dam. Within 10 weeks, they'd built 3 dams. And then at the end of that 10 weeks, it rained. And the flood peak leaving the site for the first time was dramatically reduced. So that was the first big thing, is it began to hold water on a site. Now, if I can ask you to just imagine a piece of a river, a length of river, which can be dammed, it's like a battery, a water battery, and water enters at one end and then leaves at the other. In other words, it charges up and it discharges. Now, before the beavers came, the battery was broken. The rain charged up and it discharged straight away. 10 weeks after the beavers came, we had this rainfall event where it charged up really quickly, but it discharged quite slowly. And that, over the last 5 years, that effect has just increased and increased. And so that's the number one thing, is they fix the hydrology. We'll think of headwater streams as being erosive environments. But when we have the right fauna in place, when we have what should be in place in North America and Europe and Northern Asia, when we have that beaver in place, our stream no longer behaves in an erosive way. It behaves in a much more sedimentary way. It behaves much more like a big river, and that you get, in the same size valley, you suddenly have large bodies of water moving very slowly. And these bodies of water, as high-speed water enters a system where there are beavers, the velocity drops, the energy comes out of that water, and it drops its sediment load. So straight away, just by being there and building their dams, we are cutting the flood discharge, and we're holding on to lots and lots of sediment. And that sediment is carrying nutrient off the surrounding land. So we're capturing nutrient, and that nutrient is no longer heading downstream and straight out to sea. We're also, by that water slowing down, we're creating the conditions for algae to really generate fast in those big, slow-moving bodies of water. And that algae, that is like the basis for every aquatic food web there is going. And it is so abundant, and there's so much life drawn to that, that it begins to spill out beyond the pond, beyond those ponds. Such that I'll give you a little example. Some of the macro invertebrates there, like dragonflies, for example, they're big, they're active flyers, they fly out beyond that sort of immediate riparian zone. And there they get taken by birds, such as there's a bird of prey we have here called a merlin, which will catch them and eat them. It attracts a very wide range of bats. You know, we have 13 species of bat where I live in my part of the world. 11 of those species are present foraging over our beaver ponds through the year. So, you know, that's the next part about it. It's not just that it's slowing the water down and catching all this sediment, they are generating life. You know, these ponds, they're a solar panel where the energy is being converted into life. Now, the next thing about this is that the sediment itself, when we look at it, it is full of nitrates and phosphate. And that nitrate and phosphate then feeds the aquatic vegetation, the sort of not just the algae, but also it feeds the macro flora as well. So, like some rushes and reeds and ferns and trees and so on. It's going absolutely ballistic in the ponds, at the edge of the ponds, and in the nearby environs. So the nutrients which are being brought down, they're not just lying there in that silt passively, it's being consumed by the vegetation around it. So we are actively cleaning up that water as we go along. And one of the features of the sediment is that it is very rich in organic matter, partly through things like leaves and vegetable matter being washed down in times of flood, but also from the remains of dying algae and fauna and so on settling in that sediment as well. So if we're catching lots of organic matter, it means at the same time we're catching carbon. And I can absolutely assure you that the amount of methane being given off, because there is methane given off, that is being by far outweighed by the amount of carbon that's lying there, barely decomposed in that anaerobic environment.
So from what you're saying, Chris, from what you're saying, meandering rivers generally are better because when you slow down, if you have, let's say, a river that's going straight line down from a higher height to a lower height, it's going to be stripping more of the minerals and just flushing it out into whatever larger body it empties into. But if it meanders with ponds and whatnot, it's going to spread out more horizontally across the landscape. And so you'll get trees and more diversity and more mulch and peat and all that kind of stuff further out from the main body of water.
Exactly. You know, a stream, it comes with a floodplain, and historically, because we've removed beavers from our landscape, and then we've actively sought to increase the drainage in the mistaken idea that getting rid of water faster is good for us, good for farming. We are just using our streams now as basically a drain to get rid of water off our land as fast as possible. And I think slowly we're learning, we're getting a pretty serious lesson from climate change that actually we need to keep our water on our land as long as we can.
Now, you mentioned about the effects where we've talked about the effects of water and stuff. What happens in terms of the biodiversity? Because when you have ponds, if let's say you have a, a river or a stream that's going through someone's land and it goes, it loses 100 feet in height, but instead of going straight down, basically the 100 feet, it meanders here and there. Um, how does that increase the biodiversity? Is it I would assume, fish, obviously if they're swimming upstream to spawn, are going to want to, be in a pond. It increases, I would guess, their ability to drop their eggs. How does it help the other animals as well?
Okay, well, basically, because of this collection of very slow-moving water, algae can commence, and where you've got your phytoplankton, you'll soon find zooplankton as well. And where you find zooplankton, you'll find bigger creatures eating that. And so you just get this incredibly intense, complex web of food relationships running through the whole site. It's really no mystery. And some of the results of that are that at our site, we have had, in the last 5 years, we've had 10 new bird records. That I've lived here for 60 years, and there's 10 species of bird we've never seen here before, and that have been recorded. So, and that's because we're having an incredibly rich variety of habitat types in a very small area with a lot of food. Ecology is basically about trading food, trading energy, capturing energy from the sun, and then moving that through a system of gradually larger and more complex organisms. And what the beavers do by holding up the water is they provide the means of that happening, but by having these slow-moving ponds, slow-moving water, lots of algae, and everything else. It's a bit like, if you imagine there's a stream without any beavers in. It's a bit like a garden fire, burning up your leaves in the autumn. There's a bit of smoke, there's a bit of flame, nothing very exciting. If you put beavers into that system, it's like throwing gasoline on there. You just suddenly find things going on that you just didn't believe were possible. We've seen with fish in our lower ponds, which are relatively small ponds, the size of trout there has doubled since the beavers came. In our top pond, that increase is about eightfold. And there's nothing responsible for that apart from beavers, by creating the food and the water, the habitat for those creatures to live in. We have 17 species of dragonflies recorded on the site every year. I find it hard to express what an incredible contribution these animals can make.
Well, let me ask about plant life and fungal life as well. I know here in the U.S. the western half of the country is generally drying out, and beavers have been positive as a way to help fight against forest fires. What when the beavers create the ponds and expand the wetlands, I would assume then trees can then store more water within their bodies. And I would also think that a wetter environment also helps fungi, which would help decompose matter more, which would add to what would we call it, the soil, the topsoil, the peat, and that kind of thing. So, can you talk a little bit about fungus and plant life and how they benefit from a beaver?
There is no doubt whatever in drier environments, bringing water there is enabling a much wider range of vegetation to flourish. Um, Emily Fairfax of University of the Channel Islands in California has done a huge amount of work on fire and beavers. And there are now numerous examples where beaver occupied valleys have acted as fire breaks and as refugia for wildlife from the surrounding land to go and get into where there is water and where vegetation is still functioning. You know, after the fire's gone and everything else surrounding the area is a blackened hell, adjacent to the beaver ponds, there's still plenty of green vegetation going. So the evidence for this is out there and it's burgeoning. I'm not a mycologist, so I can't really say a lot about fungi, except that coming back to my site here, there is a great deal of fungi around. And again, it's partly, I believe, because of the wetting of soil and so on, but also the incredible range of habitat type. You know, the beavers, they don't just build a dam, fell some trees, and leave it at that. They eat a very wide range of the plants that are around them. In fact, in our site, I can think of no plant that they never eat. There are one or two that don't eat very much, but nearly everything in there is a food source for them. And because of that, where you get an overabundance of one plant, such as, let's say, brambles, which can become almost a monoculture underneath trees, they clear that out. And where they clear it out, you begin to get grass appearing, you get ferns appearing, you get all sorts of sedges and flowers coming. So they're all the time, they're making simple habitats into much more complex ones, much more diverse habitats. And so far as I know, there are very, very few other animals that can do that for us.
Um, let's move on and talk a little bit about why the beavers declined. You said how they were very useful for humans, clothing, hats, castor oil, etc. What was the turning point where beavers stopped being a resource to exploit, and people first started saying, "Hey, you know, this is an important species to take care of, not to kill off." You know, how did we come to that knowledge without driving them to extinction?
Well, I think with the Eurasian beaver, it was sheer good luck. They were driven down by the end of the 19th century down to maybe 1,200 individuals left across their range in a number of small refugia, and there were these. Okay, well, with the Eurasian beaver, they ended up down to a very small population in a few scattered refugia in Norway, in the south of France, in Germany, and several pockets in Russia and possibly Mongolia as well. Very, very small numbers and in very inhospitable places. As for the American beaver, canadensis, I think I have read that they were just about on their last legs as a commercial concern by about 1830. I have read that this was due to a change in fashion with hats, that suddenly silk hats became the thing, and that there was a drop in demand. And luckily for Canadensis, there was still tens of thousands of North American beavers left, and they began to reproduce again. But I'm told by colleagues from Canada who are sitting next to me that the hunting never really completely stopped. And in fact, even in the 1930s, thousands of beavers were being harvested from Canada. So there we go. Why did it happen? I think basically because in Europe they were always seen as a prey species. They were always useful, and when the colonists arrived in America, beavers across Europe were probably getting pretty close to being extinct, and suddenly they arrived into a continent with maybe 200 million beavers in it. And an awful lot of Native Americans who actually quite liked the trade goods available, such as knives and axes and maybe a few guns and what have you, and were a very willing workforce. You know, they'd be very happy to trade skins for those trade items, and who knows, maybe a bit of booze as well. And once they got into that trade, that drove the development of the North America faster and more certainly than anything else. You know, there were wars fought over beavers, quite literally wars fought over beavers.
Yeah.
Nations were built on them.
Well, the whole Hudson's Bay Company was basically founded on beaver pelts.
Completely, and it wasn't just Hudson's Bay. It was the American Fur Company, the Lewis and Clark expedition. That was basically going to find fur. That's what that was about, and building relationships with the Native American tribes in order to get those furs when they began to develop the trade there. No, I don't think there's ever been a trade on land quite like the beaver trade. And I think that what happened in North America probably echoed what happened in Europe, but in Europe it happened quite a long time before, so much less is known about it. You know, with the trade from North America, basically every pelt that got exported was a number on someone's shipping manifest. So we know a great deal more about it.
So let's talk a little bit about non-beaver habitats, because I've read some stuff and seen some videos where people have thought that beavers might be exportable to other areas. And when we're talking about Eurasia, which we're talking from Siberia over to Northern Europe, we're talking about America, the US and Canada, which is a little bit colder generally than Europe was. That's their habitat, is everything from, say, I guess, the boreal forest down to the deciduous forests. But I've also seen people think that beavers might be able to help elsewhere. And I'm wondering what you think of that idea, because invasive species generally, you know, it's the consequences that we don't foresee. Could beavers be exported to other parts of the world and do the same thing? For example, if we're talking about water retention, to stop the expansion of the Sahara, could beavers be used in the Sahel, in some of those kinds of rivers?
Do you know, it's something I think about quite a lot. I think about the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. The Atlas Mountains in Morocco, there are several species there which are essentially European species. You know, they have deer in Morocco, that come from Europe. I believe wild boar as well. I don't know enough about the vegetation there, but yeah, maybe there'd be potential to have them there. I expect the local people will be very pleased to have their water hang around a bit longer. But
But would they
there are.
would they necessarily be a fit? I mean, because a lot of people, I'm thinking about like Australia. Australia had what they had with that was the emu wars. Or they imported some bird or the cassowaries, and there was a war fought between Australia and them. I mean, is there an environment where beavers could actually be harmful if they're exported into non-native environments?
Um, uh, okay, so I think about it a lot. My my feeling is that it is incredibly risky. Um, they will absolutely. There are tens of thousands of beavers in Patagonia, in South America, and they have devastated native woodland there, close to streams. Now, they were taken there essentially to try and kickstart a fur trade. I have no idea if they're being exploited for fur or not. I understand that some of those things that we see as benefits of beavers, i.e., slowing flow and retaining water, which is useful in times of drought, I think some of those things still happen in Patagonia with the presence of beavers there, but the native vegetation is taking a caning. So, a lot of this depends on value judgments. What do you kind of value more? It's not an argument I ever want to get into, frankly. That would be for people in Patagonia to decide.
So let's talk about the lumber or the timber industry, because I know people in Canada and especially in the northwestern U.S. over the last few decades have always complained about, oh, we got to save this species. We need jobs, jobs, jobs. Uh, is there ever how, for example, in England, if you allow beavers onto your property, sooner or later they're going to get into your neighbor's property. And suppose your neighbor is, raising, some kind of tree that he wants to sell for, X amount of dollars. How do you contain the beavers and get that balance between what's good for the environment in general and what may not be good specifically for a particular individual or a particular landscape?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there are some rivers which I would be very reluctant to put beavers into, and these are ones which are flowing through very flat landscape with very high value farmland, with rivers stuck behind levees. Because where you have this, you've got a real chance for serious conflict with farmers. And I think we should not be trying to encourage that. We should be doing everything to avoid that we can. Where we're talking about rivers that would benefit from having beavers in without the risk of massive conflict, we then get into more about the situation you're talking about. So, if you have trees of value, either sentimental value or financial value, close to your land, close to a river where there are beavers, you better protect those trees, because beavers don't care what tree they bite into. They're more likely to attack some than others, but they might go for anything. That's the first point. And the protection itself need not be expensive at all. And in fact, we just have now in Britain, the government is offering finance for protection of trees. And we've done some of it in our own place with the beavers there, not because we particularly want to preserve all those trees, but just to show people that when beavers come, it's not the end of the world. It's very easy to defend a tree if you want to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, it does. So let's talk about some pilot projects. So I've seen some videos, a lot of UK groups. Where in the UK is it feasible and beneficial for beavers? The Scottish Highlands, Wales, the south of England, and where is it not?
For me, I would say pretty much anywhere in the south of England, in a line, say, from London through to Bristol, anywhere south of that would be more or less okay. And then if you take a line north-south through England and into Wales, anywhere, let's say on a line, north-south line that runs through York, more or less, that would be okay. And then most of Scotland. It so happens that on one river in Scotland where there are beavers, there's a lot of conflict. But it's because they have a part of that river runs through some very, very flat agricultural land where the river is stuck behind levees. It's above the level of the surrounding farmland. And if the beavers burrow through the banks, which they're quite capable of doing, the banks collapse and a field gets flooded. And, someone might lose a crop that's worth thousands of pounds an acre just overnight. So we should be avoiding those rivers which have that kind of land alongside them.
I saw some videos and read up on some stuff that in southern Germany, near the Alps, beavers have been reintroduced, and they're raving about the economic benefits in southern Germany. And granted that what you talked about, some of the flat farmland. Has there been similar success stories in England where it's not just because a lot of times people will be like, oh yeah, I'm an environmentalist, unless it, but they really want to know the economic issues. Have there been pilot programs that have successfully shown that the benefits of beavers in terms of money not put towards fire prevention or not put towards the cleanup of this or that mess? And do they help if you had some kind of economic disaster like an oil truck spill? That I would think that a wetter environment will more easily, even though it moves slower, is going to be more efficient in cleaning up that environment in say a 5-year period.
So far as I'm aware, the only tangible economic benefits so far are around ecotourism. But we can extrapolate a lot from our experiment here on my farm and from other sites on the country where flood peaks have been diminished by beavers. And so if we talk about my village, 17 houses in my village get flooded. Every time it floods, it's always the same 17 houses. It's just because where they're built in relation to the stream. So that costs, according to the Environment Agency, that costs about £500,000 every time it floods. It floods every 10 years. So that says to me the annual cost of flooding in simple terms is £50,000. Now, a pair of beavers costs about £4,000. So let's say we invest in 10 pairs of beavers and distribute those around the catchment above that village. If they perform like the beavers we have here inside an enclosure, we're not going to see any more flooding. It will be very, very unlikely. Now, the cost of managing those beavers later on, if they start to cause problems like blocking the odd culvert or this kind of thing, are going to be tiny compared to that £50,000 a year flooding cost. You see, it's using an essentially a free service by an extraordinary animal just going about its daily business that can have a profound effect on the economy of that village.
And you could just transport them if they're doing damage, say 100 miles to the north at a place that might need beavers.
It is a fundamental that these animals are relatively easy to catch. It's why they nearly went extinct in the first place. So you can translocation is a ready tool, and we shouldn't forget when we get to the stage of saturation. Now this would be decades away, maybe even centuries away. When we get to the point when there are so many, there's nowhere left to move them to. They are an incredible resource.
Yeah, and if you manage them well, you get the best of both worlds.
That is my view. That's not necessarily popular in conservation circles, but that's my view. They would certainly eventually, long after you and I are dead. But if we have them in numbers, then they could easily become a resource.
Yeah, and we cull deer here in the U.S. They keep population under control. If a particular state says we need to have no more than 50,000 deer, and they produce 20,000 more the next spring, well, then they'll pick off the old bucks and the older and more sickly ones, and everyone gets a license. So,
Yeah.
So,
and
yeah, go ahead.
I'll just like to add that in some European countries, there is no protection of beavers. Sweden has 130,000 beavers now running around, and they have no protection beyond the close season. They're not allowed to kill them at a certain time of the year, but apart from that, hunters can take them any time. Now, it doesn't get overdone. In fact, I believe the population is still growing there. It's not being overdone by hunters because for them, hunting a beaver isn't particularly exciting. They'd much rather shoot a moose and have something something substantial to take home. So I don't think hunting per se is very likely to see beavers off.
When you mentioned Sweden, that just brought to mind. Do native cultures, even in Europe, like the Sami people or the Laplanders, have they also, is beaver a big part of their culture? Is this also part of sort of getting back to more a nativist view of life?
That is an incredibly good question, Dan, and I do not know. I'm sitting next to a gentleman who's more or less an expert on anario and grey owl, and we've been talking a lot about this. But so far as I know, there's not very much of that in Europe. I do know that in Persia, they used to call beavers water dogs, and they were revered because of their ability to engineer water. And I wonder how much they taught the Persians about irrigation.
Chris, I want to go back to a couple of things you said earlier in the show and follow up. You had spoken about, and I used the term keystone species, which it seems to be proliferate in a lot of these videos you see. I'm going to try to do some shows on the revival of the mammoth steppe and also the reintroduction of bison. And they're often called keystone species. You said that there are some species that are called that but aren't that. Can you give me one or two examples of what people call keystone species that you say are not, and why they aren't compared to a beaver?
Okay. Let's think of the British context. People talk about bringing wolves back, and I would love to see wolves come back. But the fundamental changes that they were bringing would, I believe, be nothing compared to beavers. Wolves won't help stop flooding. Wolves won't result in a whole bunch of species that had disappeared from an area coming back. So they're nice to have, but I don't think they're essential. You know, we can more or less do what a wolf does. I know of places in the Highlands now where they have just gone really intensive on the deer control, and lo and behold, shrubs are coming back, trees are growing where they haven't done for a long time. So, you know, we can substitute that ourselves if we need to. With beavers, what beavers do, I think that would be incredibly hard for us to do. I probably haven't answered your question very well.
Well,
But I
no,
don't
no,
know.
you actually did, because I had mentioned earlier Yellowstone and the wolves benefit there. But there you also have a larger ecosystem. You have buffalo. You also have a very sparse human population. You know, you can't be introducing a wolf pack in between two major cities and then wonder why, you know, people go hiking and they end up dead. You can go literally 100 miles in Wyoming or Montana before you see another person.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
You also had mentioned some interesting facts and figures about beavers. If you could give me a handful of some interesting facts and figures, especially those that may have a real good linkage to, as I mentioned, global warming and the beavers, how they are a key cog in that.
Okay, so I think with the climate change ideas, beavers can mitigate some of these effects, i.e., more erratic rainfall and heavier rainfall and more intense droughts. Beavers can help to mitigate those. Beavers cannot halt climate change. The only way to halt climate change is to stop burning fossil fuel. I'm sorry, folks. That is the only way. And while we persist in burning fossil fuel, we will persist in increasing the carbon dioxide content of the air, and we will persist in increasing climate change. It's not cows that are causing climate change. I'm afraid it's us driving to work, flying around holiday, buying plastic stuff. You know, and it's a really hard thing to take in. What beavers do by creating their ponds is they sequester carbon in those ponds, and where land is getting wetted adjacent to those water courses, we're getting anaerobic processes going on in the soil, which increases the rate of carbon sequestration. So there's that. Also, we're creating refugia for aquatic life. You know, this year, one of the streams flowing into our beaver pond completely dried up. But the beavers managed to keep water going in there by digging down, and they dug down until water accumulated. So they had somewhere where they had clean water to go and drink. But the stream coming in had completely dried up, which is something I hadn't seen in 60 years living here. So, but they everything they do is good for life, for other life. And the more of that we have, the more life is thriving, the greater the sort of mitigation of climate change. And I think when we get to those dry habitats like you see in the Western states, or in Southern Europe come to that, the more we can get beavers established there, the more the little rainfall that does fall will be kept on the land and keep life going. There's been some extraordinary work done by the University of Utah, Utah State, over the years. And also, just anecdotally, I met a rancher from Wyoming in about 2012, 2014, and they'd had a long-term drought, and their ranch was just about out of business. They lived in the Bighorn Basin. Beavers turned up, and it saved their ranch because they had a place where the little water that was coming downstream from snowmelt and so on could be kept, and that re-wetted the land either side, so they began to get pasture back. And you imagine a ranch without pasture isn't much good. So just this really, really simple thing is helping to fight climate change. And boy, do we need it. Every time a place gets parched or burnt out, it's one less place that we can grow food or produce food. It's one less place for animals and life to thrive. We're screwing up environments really, really fast now, and these animals can help to undo some of that.
So let me just end by asking you a little bit more about Beaver Trust and what your the future of your organization is, and what is your vision, say, 50 years, you talked about it, once we're gone, long after you and I are dead, say by the year 2100, what is your vision of a beaverful world, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I think a Beaver Trust is here to promote beavers in the media, in political circles, and in popular culture. Beaver Trust is here to help communities re-establish beavers in their areas, communities and farmers and landowners. And I have no doubt at all that already we've been successful in, with others, but successful in pushing the campaign for beavers returning to our land to be recognised. Until a week ago, beavers were not recognised as a native mammal in Britain. But now they are, and now they have official protection as well. That actually was enacted on the 1st of October, and it is fabulous news. What do I see for a beaverful world? Well, I'd like to think that in all of those parts of the country where there are rivers where we can have beavers without inculcating too much conflict with people. I think we should just take a pause just for a second and aside and say there are no real beaver problems or beaver management problems. What we have is people management problems. It's where beavers don't care what river they're in. As long as they've got water and food, they will pretty well cope. The bad stuff happens when they upset people, and I'm sure that's the same in North America as it is here. And where they upset people, where they're not where their activity is not understood, then look out. So, in a beaverful world, I would want to see every river that can support beavers with relatively little human conflict. I'd like to see beavers present at capacity. I'd like to see beavers being a normal part of life and no longer newsworthy. I'd like to see people thoroughly familiar. I think that's the term I'd use, familiar with the animals and their impacts and how to live alongside them without having to get state intervention. And I'd like to think that this beaverful world will be one where we have much more abundant bird life and insect life, fish life and amphibian life, and have the life, if you like, breathed back into our river valleys, which have frankly become pretty sterile over the last couple of 100 years.
Well, I want to thank you for spending about an hour speaking about it, Chris Jones. I'll link below this video to your organization, Beaver Trust, and thank you very much for informing us.
You're really, really welcome. And if any of your listeners are coming across to the UK, can get down to Cornwall, please come and visit Cornwall Beaver Project.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.